By the time the executioners brought Anne Askew to the pyre at Smithfield in the summer of 1546, her body had been so systematically dismantled that she could no longer walk. She had to be carried through the streets of London in a chair and chained directly to the wooden stake just to keep her upright. This was not the work of a rogue torturer or the chaotic violence of a battlefield. It was a calculated destruction authorized by the highest legal officers of the Tudor state, executed by a system that believed her silence threatened the crown itself. What happened in the subterranean darkness of the Tower of London was never meant to reach the public ear, but history leaves a paper trail, even for its most hidden cruelties. Interrogated and illegally racked by the chancellor. The men who walked into the torture chamber were not ordinary guards. They were the architects of English law. In the final, paranoid months of King Henry VIII's reign, the English court was a blood-soaked chessboard. The king was morbidly obese, his body failing, his mind consumed by suspicion. Around his dying form, a vicious political war raged between the rising Protestant reformers and the deeply entrenched conservative Catholic faction. The Conservatives, led by Bishop Stephen Gardiner and Lord Chancellor Thomas Wriothesley, were losing ground. They needed a massive, devastating strike to purge the reformist influence from the king's inner circle. Specifically, they needed a target to bring down the ultimate prize, Queen Catherine Parr. They believed Anne Askew, a 25-year-old noblewoman, a known reformist, and an outspoken preacher with connections to the Queen's ladies-in-waiting, held the key. If they could force her to name the aristocratic women who read banned English Bibles, they could tie the heresy directly to the Queen's royal chambers. That is where the Lord Chancellor of England stepped into the dark. The title of Chancellor carries a very different weight depending on the century. In the modern era, a Chancellor navigates national policy, economic treaties, and parliamentary debate. But in 1546, the Lord Chancellor of England wielded power through bone and sinew. Thomas Wriothesley was not there to negotiate a confession. He was there to extract one by any physical means necessary. The state had already subjected Askew to months of psychological warfare. She had been arrested, interrogated at Sadler's Hall, subjected to days of exhausting theological cross-examination by the Bishop of London, released, and then arrested again. The interrogators battered her with theological traps, pressuring her to recant her beliefs regarding the Eucharist. Under the brutal Act of 6 Articles, denying the literal transubstantiation of the communion bread was an automatic death sentence. Yet she parried every intellectual thrust with precise, unyielding scriptural knowledge. Frustrated by her intellect and her absolute refusal to implicate the Queen's inner circle, the state escalated its methods. She was transferred to the Tower of London. What followed was a direct violation of their own legal code. Under English law, it was strictly illegal to subject a woman, particularly a gentlewoman of noble birth, to the rack. The rack, a terrifying instrument known darkly as the Duke of Exeter's daughter, was a wooden frame equipped with rollers, ropes, and levers. It was designed to slowly place extreme strain on a person's frame, causing severe and lasting damage. It was a machine built to break people, reserved almost exclusively for the most hardened traitors and enemies of the state. But the rules of justice evaporate when an empire is terrified of what it cannot control. Askew was led down into the White Tower. She was ordered to strip off her outer garments. The executioners bound her wrists and ankles to the heavy wooden rollers. Sir Anthony Kingston, the lieutenant of the tower, oversaw the initial turning of the levers. As the ropes went taut, applying pressure to her frame in opposite directions, Askew remained silent. She did not scream. She did not beg for mercy. Most importantly, she did not offer a single name of the Queen's ladies. Kingston, a man hardened by years of overseeing state executions and interrogations, eventually stepped back. Looking at the young woman stretched across the timber, he refused to turn the mechanism any further. He stated it was enough. recognizing that continuing would not only break the law, but likely kill her before she could face a public execution. That decision, made for entirely rational, perhaps even merciful reasons, is what set everything in motion. Lord Chancellor Wriothesley and his close ally, Sir Richard Rich, were enraged by the lieutenant's hesitation. They demanded Kingston proceed. When he formally refused and left the chamber to ride immediately to the king to seek a pardon for his disobedience, the institutional cruelty of the Tudor state reached its peak. Wriothesley and Rich stripped off their heavy velvet gowns of office. The two highest-ranking legal officials in the nation took the iron levers into their own bare hands. They manually operated the device. They applied the tension so forcefully that Askew's frame was severely compromised. They extended her limbs until her major points of movement were entirely displaced. The mechanical pressure overcame her physical integrity and stripped her of everything that had once defined her physical independence. She was left entirely, permanently crippled. When they finally released the tension, she fainted from the excruciating agony. Wriothesley, still desperate for names, ordered her revived, sitting on the cold stone floor beside her broken body to interrogate her for 2 more hours. Think about what that meant in practice. The architects of the nation's justice system, sweating in a subterranean dungeon, personally directing the physical breakdown of a woman with their own hands because her theology and her silence stood in the way of their political survival. They got exactly what they wanted from her body, but they did not get what they needed from her voice. She never gave them a single name. Carried broken to the Smithfield pyre. The dates of her final week are a ledger of institutional cruelty. Following the illegal racking, Askew was thrown onto the bare floor of a cell. She could not feed herself, she could not turn over, and she was in a state of constant burning agony. Yet in the days between her torture and her scheduled death, she dictated her final writings. She recorded exactly what Wriothesley and Rich had done to her, ensuring that the state's secret violence would be preserved for history. When it became clear that her body was destroyed, but her resolve was untouched, the Crown scheduled her execution for July 16, 1546. The City of London gathered at Smithfield. The execution of a heretic was never meant to be a quiet or private affair. It was a massive public spectacle, heavily attended, designed to demonstrate the absolute and terrifying power of the state over the individual. Smithfield was an open space, traditionally used as a meat market, but it served a dual purpose as the Crown's preferred theatre for burning dissenters. A massive crowd pushed forward against the wooden barricades, the summer air heavy with anticipation, waiting for the condemned to walk her final steps. But Anne Askew could not walk. The damage inflicted by the Lord Chancellor was irreversible. She was brought through the crowded, filthy streets of London in a chair, supported on all sides by officers of the Crown. When the procession finally reached the execution site, the physical reality of the state's violence was put on full display. Askew could not stand against the stake. The executioners had to physically lift her shattered frame out of the chair and prop her against the heavy wooden post. Because her legs could bear no weight, they wrapped a thick iron chain tightly around her waist, bolting it to the wood to hold her upright. This is usually described as a moment of ultimate physical defeat. It was not. Her crippled body was actually the visible, undeniable proof of the state's failure. By carrying her to the pyre, the authorities inadvertently displayed the lengths they had gone to and the laws they had broken, in their desperate, unsuccessful attempt to make her submit. Rome did not merely punish, and neither did the Tudors. They performed. But on this day, the performance revealed the panic of the directors. The procession wasn't over, neither was the humiliation. Before the executioners were allowed to light the fires, the state demanded one final performance of dominance. Nicholas Shaxton, a former reformist bishop who had cowardly recanted his own beliefs just weeks earlier to save his life from the flames, was appointed to preach the execution sermon. He stood in a specially constructed wooden pulpit before the massive crowd and loudly proclaimed the errors of Askew's ways. He weaponized his own surrender, urging her to repent, to abandon her heresy, and to save her soul while she still had breath in her lungs. It was procedural cruelty designed to break her spirit publicly where the rack had failed privately. Even chained, crippled, and facing imminent immolation, Askew refused to be a passive victim in her own murder. As Shaxton preached, she actively audited his sermon from the stake. When he spoke scripture correctly, she nodded her head and told the crowd he spoke well. But when he misrepresented the biblical text to serve the crown's agenda, she loudly corrected him over the noise of the crowd, declaring that he missed the true meaning of the word. She dismantled the state's theological arguments in real time, effectively hijacking the spectacle meant to humiliate her. High in a raised, covered platform overlooking the smoke-stained grounds of Smithfield, Lord Chancellor Wriothesley sat alongside the Lord Mayor of London and the Duke of Norfolk, watching the execution unfold. Sensing that the spectacle was slipping from their control, Wriothesley made one final desperate maneuver. He sent a messenger down to the pyre with written letters adorned with the King's Great Seal. The messenger offered her a royal pardon, promising her life and freedom if she would only recant her beliefs and name her accomplices. She refused to even look at the paper. She declared in a voice loud enough for the front rows to hear that she had not come to Smithfield to deny her lord and master. The other 3 men condemned to burn beside her, John Lascelles, John Adams, and Nicholas Belenian, drew strength from her defiance and similarly refused the pardons. The system had a name for what came next. It was the absolute execution of the law. Gunpowder tied to her condemned body. Fire was the legally mandated punishment for heresy, but mercy in the Tudor era took a grotesque form. Under the English legal doctrine of de heretico comburendo, burning at the stake was designed to be a slow, agonizing preview of hell. Victims did not usually die from the flames themselves. They died from the searing heat, the gradual asphyxiation as the fire consuming the oxygen around them, and the agonizing, prolonged failure of their internal systems. The executioners were trained to build the faggots of wood in a way that ensured the fire burned slowly, starting at the feet and working its way up. The process was entirely visible to the watching crowd, the ultimate psychological deterrent to anyone harboring dissenting thoughts against the crown. But someone in London had intervened. Whether it was sympathetic friends hidden in the crowd, a covert operation organized by the Queen's reformist circle, or executioners secretly paid off to hasten her end, a slight alteration had been made to the grim choreography of Smithfield. Small, heavy bags of gunpowder had been smuggled to the pyre. As the executioners finalized the preparations, packing the dry reeds and bundles of wood tightly around the lower halves of the 4 condemned prisoners, they subtly placed these pouches of black powder near Askew and secured them to the others bound beside her. The Lord Mayor, sitting safely away from the impending heat, gave the final order. The cry rang out across the dirt square. Fiat Justitia. Let justice be done. The torches were thrown into the base of the pyre. The dry reeds caught instantly, sending thick, choking yellow smoke billowing into the summer air. The flames began to lick up the sides of the wooden stakes, catching the larger branches, closing in on the chained prisoners. The crowd fell silent, waiting for the horrific sounds that usually echoed across Smithfield. The screams of the dying that could last for agonizing fractions of an hour. That detail changes everything about what follows. The gunpowder was not a feature of English execution law. It was a desperate underground intervention in a system built to maximize human suffering. It was a final act of rebellion against the Chancellor's desire for a prolonged, agonizing spectacle. The crowd watched as the flames climbed higher. The heat intensified, blistering the skin. But before the fire could begin its slow, methodical destruction of her vital organs, the flames reached the pouches tied to her chest and neck. The black powder ignited. The sudden, powerful event occurred at the center of the pyre. The blast was so forceful it momentarily blew the flames outward, instantly killing Anne Askew and sparing her the prolonged, excruciating agony the state had intended for her. The concussive force ended her life in a fraction of a second, leaving the fire to consume a body that was already beyond pain. The smoke eventually cleared over Smithfield, and the Tudor state claimed its hollow victory. The Conservative faction had successfully burned a heretic. But the ashes blowing across the dirt square ignited a legacy that the Crown could never extinguish. Anne Askew's smuggled writings, the detailed accounts of her interrogations, her brilliant theological defences, and her harrowing testimony of being illegally racked by the Lord Chancellor himself, were already on their way to the European continent. Within months, Protestant publishers like John Bale would print her examinations, distributing them widely across Europe and smuggling them back into England. Later, the martyrologist John Foxe would enshrine her story in his famous Book of Martyrs, transforming her from a silenced victim into one of the most powerful and enduring voices of the English Reformation. The men who broke her body returned to their palaces and their political manoeuvring, confident they had restored order and terrified the reformists into submission. But history remembers them not as righteous champions of the true faith, but as the desperate men who had to dismantle their own laws just to break a woman, and still failed to secure her silence. Queen Catherine Parr survived the Conservative plot. Henry VIII died months later, and the Protestant Reformation swept across England, fueled in part by the memory of the woman in the chair. When a government must dismantle its own legal boundaries and torture its own citizens in the dark to silence a single dissenting voice, who has truly won the war?